pause. All righty, well, welcome everybody. I am Riley Belden England, and I work on the philanthropic and alumni engagement team here. I want to welcome you all to the Alumni Speaker Series presented by the Pitt School of Social Work's Alumni Council. Our speaker today is Kyle Crawford. Kyle graduated from our MSW program in 2012 and is a strategist with nearly 2 decades of experience studying and working with movements and organizations. His work on ambiguity has been featured in industry-leading outlets such as the Stanford Social Innovation Review and Social Policy. He leads new initiatives for a $2 billion community healthcare organization in New York City and plays an active role on the board of directors of the Kelly Strayhorn Theater, a creative home rooted in the liberation of Black and queer people. Kyle has degrees in sociology and social work and was a Jonas Salk Fellow at the Jewish Healthcare Foundation. Kyle recently published Ambiguity is the Answer, Timeless Strategies for Creating Change, a digestible and deeply researched book exploring how ambiguity can drive change in a world dominated by powerful interests. I want to thank Kyle for being here today. I also want to thank Bella Coletti, a member of our Alumni Council, for facilitating the Q&A portion of the event. There will be plenty of time for audience members to ask questions. So yeah, welcome everybody. Kyle, thank you again for being here, and please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Riley. Thank you, Bella, and thank you everybody for coming. I think we could do this however we want. I'm happy to read a little bit. I'm happy to explain the book. I know we can get to questions. Yeah, we can go any way we want. I'll give an overview of the book, a tiny bit. I could read a little bit, or I could, wherever appropriate, I'll try to weave in some sort of social work influence into the book. So I will say, I mean, for one, if anybody is down for throwing stuff in the chat throughout, that'll be helpful. But I think the fun thing about ambiguity is that as a topic, it's a little, I feel like it just jolts you a little bit. You're like, I don't know how I feel about it. I think I like it. I think I don't like it. I don't know. So like, I feel like as a starting point, that's like a great, I love just that essence of it. So for me, I did a whole bunch of research into ways that people created change. That's in social movements, that's in like anti-war kicking, like people in Vietnam kicking out the United States. That's in people overthrowing slavery. That is in the arts and culture. It's in the ways that people embed meaning, like multiple meanings into lyrics, into performance. Um, how else? Community organizing is definitely a big part. That example's in New York City. Basically, like how folks outsmarted Robert Moses, who's known as sort of like this infamous power broker who was uh, did a lot of terrible things. I think for me, I came into the social work program because with a background in sociology, I felt like sociology was studying the world. Why is the world the way it is? How do groups move? How do populations move? Like what explains how we're sort of in this space? For me, social work I thought of as like applied sociology. So how do we take that knowledge of the world and how do we use that to actually apply it to the world and create change? So if we understand different things about group dynamics and power dynamics and community organizing and people's needs and psychology, how do we take that and not just write research papers and feel like we understand things better than we used to, but how do we actually take that and say, okay, the world's crazy. There's a lot of change that needs to be created, and let's apply that in order to create change. I think for me, where ambiguity came in is this kind of tension between the way we talk about trying to create change and I think the frustration that you face when you try to create change and pair that with kind of research into like deeper histories about how it comes about. And so I think the story we're often told, and I grew up into for sure, was you should be very loud, you should be very vocal, you should be clear about your demands. And I grew up in like anti-Iraq war organizing. which was basically like it felt like there was a carrot being dangled, which was like, well, if you organize enough people to protest, the war will stop. Like, if you just communicate more clearly the why it should stop, the war will stop. And it was like this dangled promise and this sort of like frustrating thing that you could always, it was like a baked in excuse always. Well, you didn't quite organize enough people. Not quite enough people protested. You guys weren't all on the exact same page, so we didn't know what to do. And so I felt like there was these frustrations baked into sort of like the narrative about what you're supposed to do to bring about change, that when you actually do it, you go like, this is BS. It's not getting us anywhere. And actually what we're doing following this is we're setting ourselves up, I think, to try the same tactics over and over and have somebody tell us it still wasn't quite enough people, it wasn't quite clear enough, hence nothing's going to change. So like I think for me, there was like this kind of history of that actual experience. I grew up in kind of like punk organizing too, like very DIY, like direct action kinds of work. We send books to people who are incarcerated. We feed people who have no home and need food. Like it was very direct. The messaging was always very direct. And I think that there's a need for that. But I think as time went on for me, like, there's always in the chapter on Thurgood Marshall, there's like somebody calls it the delicate turmoil of tensions or something. It's basically like, what is the most direct good I can do immediately? And what is the best long-term good I can do. And I think that as humans, probably as social workers, like you're always balancing like, well, this feels good to do because it's very direct and tangible, but I would love to be able to change a system or I'd love to be able to change something much bigger. And so I think I was just trying to figure out I could run myself ragged doing things that in the immediate felt good and were helpful. And at some point I wanted to learn enough to try to change something bigger. So that's kind of the backstory. I want to pause for a second because I'll keep going. But if any initial reactions, questions, skepticisms, challenges, I feel like back and forth will be a fun way to do it.
Well, I just like to say I think you're in good company. I think we all came to social work because at one point we were told we're the types of people who carry the weight of the world on our shoulders. And that's a lot of what I just gathered from you. So I think, unless other people have any immediate questions, this might be kind of a good time to segue into the prepared questions that we have, many of which you've kind of touched on a little bit, but I'd like to dig a little bit deeper into them. But yeah, I'd love to give the opportunity for anyone else who wanted to respond. All right. Well, you talked a lot about, oh, sorry. All right.
So,
Ariel
um,
has a question. All right. Do you have a working definition that you like to use for ambiguity? It's
Thank
interesting.
you, Ariel. Um, yeah, I mean, I waffle on this a little bit. My default is to go to the most literal, which is basically it's anything that has multiple interpretations. So, yeah, that's the basic way. There's definitely, I think, the way that we use it generally, I feel like we sort of lump like vagueness, ambiguity, complexity, uncertainty. We kind of like lump all that together. For me, though, I do think I do really take it to mean multiple interpretations of what's going on. And so, um, like to take like the cultural component, like I say at some point, like you could have a song that sounds like somebody's singing about wanting love from a partner, right? Like that's how it reads. Like I'm seeking love from this partner. Like read another way that can be interpreted as like we're seeking justice from a nation that won't give it to us. And so like that I think that idea that there's one meaning being conveyed to one group or sort of one audience, but another audience might actually read and be seeing a totally different one, or actually that somebody could just be seeing both of them, right? I find that fascinating, and I actually find to go back to kind of like the purpose of ambiguity with the book and change is essentially that people in power if you can sort of like keep up the appearance to people in power at times that nothing is occurring, but at the same time you're embedding all of this cultural messaging that is organizing folks, that is sort of empowering folks, that is like laying the groundwork for all these actions. The fact that you're not doing that openly actually buys you the space and time to build the community and the intimacy and the trust and the connections that you need. So when you become more open, that messaging has already been clear to your folks, and the other group might have never seen it coming. I think that like for me, like there's some essence of like we need to start incorporating some of that into social change work. So yeah, I definitely take it as like things that appear one way or that appear multiple ways. Some people see multiple interpretations. Some might only read one into them. Um, but that gap between those different understandings, I think, is where a lot of the opportunity rests.
Oh, that's great, Kyle. I really, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say that like it is actually funny, like in some of the research, like I stayed out of digging into straight up ambiguity research too much because like some of it is just super dry. It's like it's very linguistics, like it's very linguistics based, or it's very yeah, it takes like the I don't know. It was like not I was like, if I read too much of this, like I'm gonna start to care about this read. And like I don't care about the linguistical like differences between this and this like syntactical something. Like I was like, it's a rabbit hole that I'm not really intrigued by, but the actual book includes every chapter has a different application of ambiguity. So it's like it's ambiguity applied in a different kind of way. And so in that way, you sort of see how this idea of multiple interpretations plays out sort of in all these different ways. So it is to me, it's a concept that we should allow there to be the space to kind of play with it. And actually the obsession kind of in some of the research around trying to nail it down, um, ironically makes it like I feel like it almost makes the point that it's hard to pinpoint a definition of things. I should say too, since we're doing this, is like ambiguity for me is like it sits in. It doesn't sit in like looking at something and what's the linguistical something. It sits in like this context of power and definition and meaning. Like who determines what something means or is defined. Toni Morrison has a great line like definitions belong to the definers, not the defined. Like, and so what you're told, there's a lot of the book is holding on to this essence of like, I see how the world is telling me to view my circumstance, but I'm holding on to this different set of knowledge that tells me that what I'm looking at is actually something else. And so like, the Frantz Fanon is in here, like the colonial context of that is sort of like colonialists putting their flag up, like in Martinique could be like the French, and like thinking that the French flag represents like brotherhood and independence and freedom and whatever it actually means. But for the folks in Martinique, like they're looking at that flag and seeing domination. They're seeing the lack of freedom. They're seeing like all the antithesis of all of those things. And so a lot of the book is sort of just holding on to this essence that like the world will tell you to see yourself or see your circumstance in one way. And it's actually very important and kind of at the core of a lot of the struggle is to hold on to what you actually know to be true. And in that gap is where you sort of you get to apply it in interesting ways. So yeah, see, that's where it's like I'm like there probably is just a one sentence definition, but I'm like da 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 da. But it is yeah, you can go back to like multiple interpretations of something. Yeah.
If I could, I couldn't stop thinking about this, which maybe is not making me a good active listener, which is why I'm in macro practice, not in micro practice. So thanks for that. But and for the purposes of people who are watching the recorded version of this prior to us starting the recording, Kyle and I were talking about how one of our familiar mentors from the social work program, Dave Copeland. If you've been lucky enough to have him or you have him in the future, you will know something that he will drill in your head is that it's all about receivership. So you can provide any message, but someone's always going to interpret it differently. And that was kind of what I was gathering from your explanation. And again, it's very interesting. Like from the micro perspective, it could be like, a therapist is giving a message to a client, and that client then relays that message to a person they're having conflict with, and they perceive that situation differently. How you interpret your services at the macro level when you're writing a grant can be different, just how you word those things. So I see so many areas where this whole idea of ambiguity is applied in the work that we do, and is just so broad. Um, so again, now that we've talked a lot about this like present day work that you're doing, which is clearly so important to your identity as an individual, but I'm really curious if we can go back to your graduate experience, or about your experience as a graduate student in the School of Social Work, and also what dreams you had prepared for prior to graduation, and how does that compare to the path that followed?
So funny. Um, when I was in grad school, to be totally honest, my first instinct in the first quarter I was there was that it was much less challenging than I expected. And so, um, I don't know, my instinct at that time was to fill. I think I felt like there was going to be, yeah, I think there was just, I was kind of like, oh, I feel like the challenge was getting in, and now we're in, and the program is just to support us in the process of kind of wherever we'll end up going. What I ended up doing was trying to like fill through a bunch of part-time jobs, like all of my interests. And so I did a kind of like community recruitment work for Dr. Sean Eek's like autism psychosocial research. I was a research assistant for another professor who's since left. I had an internship, I had a fellowship. And so I felt like for me, when I was in the program, like school felt like the hub in like a wheel, like it was the centerpiece, but then out of that kind of sprung like three or four things at all times. Um, and then I think my big goal when I was in the program was it was to work towards working at a foundation. Like I was like I had done a lot of work, yeah, just in nonprofits, like since a very young age, and kind of like very grassroots organizing and volunteering and that kind of stuff. And I was like, yeah, it was like one of those things where I was just like, I wonder what it's like at that level, like where you get inside the funder realm. So in my second year, I sort of like finagled my way into an internship at the Forbes Funds that extended into like my second year internship, which is very cool because they do capacity building fundraise or grant making. So it let you see like organizations have all these kinds of issues, and how do you make sense of what those are? How do you support them? And how do you garner the funds and make sure that hopefully you're trying to help the organizations. So I feel like my big goal was like, let me get inside a foundation. I got there and then I ended up working at another foundation. And I think that yeah, I think sometimes I have to reflect and be like, that was the goal. You got to that goal, and then the goal changes, which I feel like is very human. You like you forget what you actually wanted because you got it and realized that's not what you wanted. But that's yeah, that's definitely where I was at. It's funny too though, because I feel like when I was in grad school, I was just yeah, I was very active. I was staying very busy, and I was kind of always trying to figure out like, all right, what all am I getting out of the program? Am I getting what I wanted? Am I what? And like, I don't feel like that question ever got answered during the program. But I will say, in like the decades since, I have a very different stance, which is like a bunch of close friends came out of that program. People who I've learned a ton from came from that program. So I feel like in the midst, I feel like I was trying to sort it out the whole time, but only in the year, like in the years later, you're kind of like, you're just appreciative of anybody you came into contact with. And I will say that like a ton of, yeah, wonderful people, I feel like we're similarly trying to figure it out, but have all gone on to very interesting places. And I think that I feel like that's one of the big pushes with social work is that, like you can do anything with this. You can apply it anywhere. These are unique skills, and I think it's hard to grasp that until you're around a bunch of people without those skills, and then you realize like Yeah, it is rare and valuable and helpful.
Yeah, I can certainly identify with that as someone who has since moved away from Pittsburgh and now is rebuilding that kind of network of individuals who have a similar background as myself, where I find myself having a lot less conversations, even, in my current job. I work for the state. We talk human services work every day, but sometimes I'm still, you can still be surprised by the differences in the way that you look at the world, just kind of background to background or educational experience to educational experience. I also heard you talk a lot about kind of the busyness of being an individual who is probably someone interested in social work. We like to have our hands in a lot of different pots. And eventually we hope to find out what like really shapes our career and where we want to go after that. So I appreciate that answer.
I remember talking to Dr. Eek at one point, like considering a PhD program, and he was like,
Mhm.
"You got to pick." I was like, because I was like, "Oh, I was doing autism like work. I was doing like community development work. I was doing like foundation work." And he's like, "You got to pick one thing and like one narrow thing for like a decade." And I was just like, I don't know. Like I had too many interests and I was just like, I can't, I can't. And then I spent a decade researching ambiguity. I don't know. I just like at moments where I'd think about him, I'd be like, I didn't have it then, but I was like, at some point you did just have like this like, yeah, you spent just as much time on some narrow thing, like piece of study. But yeah, that was enough to scare me off of a PhD because I didn't have
Well, why write a dissertation about one thing when you could write a
it.
whole book about a bunch of different things? Yeah.
It is.
I think you satisfied your need. Very cool. Well, let's get back to the book if you don't mind. So again, you might have touched a little bit on this already, but I'd really love to know like if you could narrow down what really inspired you to write Ambiguity as the answer. And what lessons do you believe would be most helpful to many of our social work students and to your experience as a lifelong learner?
Yeah, I mean, I think the inspiration comes from, I mean, I think I spoke to the wanting to figure out ways to create change, but I think on a personal level, it came down to like, uh, you sometimes you do so much work that you don't leave anything behind, if that makes sense. And I think that for me, I feel like when I was younger, I was definitely in that. Like, I feel like, yeah, and I feel like I just had a moment where I just had to switch out of that, and I wanted to do whatever it took to have something that you could like go back to that could like outlive you, that hopefully would kind of have a life of its own. Um, and for me, I felt like, yeah, I feel like once I got hooked on the fact that I didn't think that we were talking about this part of how change happens, I felt like we were editing it out. Um, and I kept finding it show up in different ways and in different places. I feel like once I had that, I just felt like I was willing to work on it until it got complete. I just felt like I wanted to figure out. The irony is like trying to write a book about ambiguity, but be like clear as hell. Like to be like very specific in your language, to like to make it flow, to not be overly academic, to not be like stodgy, to make it be hopeful. I think for me, I just felt like, yeah, I don't know. I've never had anything like this before, and I don't know if I ever will again. But I think that once I had it, I felt like, yeah, I would wake up and want to work on it. I would be on buses and want to work on it. I would like wake up in the middle of the night. I'd be on a walk. I'd think about it. You know what I mean? Like, um, and I really think that like if you ever get the chance to have something that you just sort of live with, like to live with a project for like a decade, to me, like it was a wild feeling. It felt very special because I feel like most of our lives we don't have something that you wake up with and it's waiting for you. It's like if you have 5 minutes, if you have an hour, if you can skip out of work a little bit, it's like sneak this into your life at any moment you can. Yeah, I feel like it was a beautiful feeling. So I think for me, yeah, I felt like I wanted to figure it out. I felt like I was onto something that um is known, but I think that we forget it. And I just wanted to like resurface that and do whatever it took to do that well. So yeah, and then the challenge of doing that well is like its own thing. You can have something to say, but then I think a book is different than any for me any other medium because it feels like it will last. And so the fear of cementing something that's messed up like is so terrifying. Like I look at very early drafts, I'm like, thank God I didn't like have the urge to just publish this because I'd just be like, you would just be like horrified with yourself. So like I'm sure I'll be horrified by parts of this, but like there the permanence is also it does push you in the fact that it's kind of terrifying to put something down that will last longer. Um so yeah. I know that's more about the process than the inspiration, but I think the inspiration's in there somewhere. Ooh, a favorite chapter. Um, Probably do. Um, there is a chapter. I know I could, if you guys are curious, I could run through like what some of the chapter titles are and who's in them and
Sure.
be
Yeah,
useful
and
for
for
people.
our individuals who may be listening to the recording, the question that was posed in the chat is, do you have a favorite chapter? So sure, if you'd like to go ahead and walk us through any of the chapters, it'd be great.
Yeah, I will say, I was like skimming. It's funny because I haven't looked through the book that much lately now that it's done. I think, I mean, the last chapter is one of my favorite. I think because to me it culminates the whole book. It's called A Distinctive Character, Ambiguity is Form. It's about the HIV/AIDS movement, um, and the kind of the unique shape that that movement took on as a result of the unique challenges of HIV and AIDS in the early years. Um, but I actually feel like I feel like maybe the one that has the most soft spot for me is this one called The Appeal of Not Knowing, which I think it was actually the kernel of the book's idea originally, was basically, I feel like we're kind of taught that like things should be easy to understand. Designers should make things like easy and intuitive and joyful. And it was like, I feel like at least a decade ago, I feel like that was real like in the air that everything should be easy and we're designing so everybody can just flow and work and that like and I kept like thinking about like gravitating towards these things that you couldn't understand but you loved. Like one of the examples is Tig Notaro. Is a stand-up comedian. She has a stand-up special where she was diagnosed with breast cancer and she went on stage, I don't know, I forget what it is, like 3 days after being diagnosed, because she thought it was the last time she could ever perform. And so she gives this stand-up special that happened to be recorded. It wasn't like meant to be a special or anything, but it's like, it's heartbreaking, it's confusing. At times it is hilarious, and it is more than anything, it's like indescribable. Like you're in this like half-hour experience with somebody processing something but kind of making jokes about it. But then also when people laugh at the wrong time, it feels like so wrong. And the whole experience is like the people who put it out said like it's something none of us have ever experienced before. Or I think Tig said that. Like it's something I don't think any of us have ever experienced before. And I think that like I think you would think like a great stand-up special should be hilarious. It should be the funniest 30 minutes or 60 minutes or whatever. And like to me, I was like, this is one of those things that like people just loved because it felt human and confusing and it wasn't packaged and well-structured jokes and it wasn't like what you're told. And so the other person on that chapter is Billie Holiday, who I think embodied a lot of that as well. But like I think it was just kind of like it's reminding us, I think, of that very human part of some of these things, which is like we don't need everything spoon-fed to us. We don't want everything easy. Like I don't know if you've ever been on a road trip where everything goes fine. Like it's not very memorable. It's like you're like, wow, we just like drove to a place, we got there, it wasn't very exciting. We just looked at each other. Like I've been on those road trips. It's like nothing. And then you go on road trips where like a lot goes wrong and you're like that it's not as fun always, but like usually the memory is like it sticks with you way longer. And I think that like there's something the premise of that chapter is kind of like I think there's a Ralph Ellison quote in there that's like, uh, the search baffles when it most intrigues or something. It's like we actually really enjoy trying to understand things, trying to solve problems, and like this urge to make things like clear and concise and digestible. I feel like it gets in the way of what is actually like very human, which is that like we like the kind of messy experience of life. Um, and it's rare to actually get to like experience that through somebody else. And so that chapter is just kind of a reminder for us to like not edit everything out, not make everything smooth and clean, but yeah, let it be something that people want to sort out. And actually, one of the interesting things is as we try to sort things out, we almost never sort out confusing things alone. Like it gives us an excuse to pull somebody else in and go, look at this. Like, have you ever heard a stand-up special like this? What is going, like, you know what I mean? Yeah. So I feel like that's a special one. But let me go, I'll run through them kind of quick for you real quick. All right. The first one's called Make It, Protect It, Pass It On. Ambiguity as Precursor. That chapter is about Thurgood Marshall, um, the kind of work he did to basically like to set a precedent of legal cases that laid the groundwork for Brown v. Board and some other big cases. And so the ambiguity there is essentially that like before big changes happen, there's usually a period that looks like not much is going on and things aren't clear. But he's a good example of somebody who sort of he was not shy about what he was doing and he wasn't like quiet about what he was up to, but he was very strategic in the way that he was laying the groundwork to create a change. And so the line in that chapter is sort of like to people with lots of power, he looked like an underfunded lawyer just trying to do too much, when he was actually being very thoughtful about which cases to introduce where. Um, Trust in the long arc, ambiguity as acceptance. It's built around Gwendolyn Brooks, but it's about the a Picasso sculpture in Chicago, which is basically there's this square. The premise is basically like Chicago wanted to be like seen as more legitimate in the world, and they felt like we're Midwestern. Nobody's taking us like, nobody's taking us seriously, so we need a Picasso sculpture. So they unveil this big sculpture and everybody hates it. And Gwendolyn Brooks like she had seen that coming and she basically like made fun of the fact that nobody was going to like it. But sort of like 50 years later, it's grown on the city and actually like it laid the groundwork for this whole momentum of public sculpture in Chicago. And so the premise there is sort of like I think in our age now, we have a tendency to want to be seen certain ways, and we want to be seen as having made it, or seen as legit, or seen as like certain professions or titles or any of that. Um, and that chapter is a reminder to kind of like be okay with the fact that you might not be understood for a long time. But if you're trusting in what you're doing, you might reach a point where people go, I didn't see it for all those years in between, but um, yeah, they were onto something. I'll go quicker through the rest of them, but conflict comes. Conflict comes. That's about Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses in New York City. It's actually built on sociology research I read in my undergrad, which is that like a lot of conflict we think comes from imbalanced power dynamics, which is true, of course. But there's also interesting research that conflict actually comes out of ambiguous relations. And so when you don't know what the dynamic actually is, people will jostle to get position, and that ambiguity actually creates conflict, and which makes sense as well. But I think I had grown up always thinking it's like this, and we're fighting up and down and da da da. And I think realizing that actually sometimes that shifting dynamic and that unknowing dynamic is actually where the conflict comes. I feel like that's a good social work tip. uh, let's see. There's all sorts of others. When the metrics don't match, ambiguity is split. That's just sort of like Charles Darwin and some other people, and basically it being revolutions in science and other fields coming about, not in incremental knowledge, but basically you end up having two ways of looking at the world, and the term is incommensurable. They don't relate, they don't overlap. You're just choosing between two wholly different worldviews, which, the ambiguity tie-in, I think, is kind of obvious, but is interesting because some of the biggest scientific shifts, they weren't just building knowledge incrementally. It's that you actually like, if you if you're in this, the social change aspect here is like, if you're trying to produce a big enough shift, what people are going to see is not like, oh, it's a small change, but actually I'm being presented with opposing worldviews about what the future looks like. um and people have to sit in that ambiguity and figure out which path to go down. But anyways, there's all sorts. Yeah, um there's labor organizing like Cesar Chavez. There's yeah, one from Vietnam. There's a little bit of everything.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, there was a lot to unpack there. And there
Yeah.
were
So
some things, no, yeah, there were some things that I found to be really interesting. And you kind of actually just came down to what I was thinking. But earlier, you were talking about this comedian who kind of gave what to some was a bit of a startling performance. And I think for social workers, especially, like, as we are going through our educational programs, as we are sitting in our field placements, like, we learn this like respect for individual experiences and also how people feel about those experiences. But then there's a lot of like, how do I teach myself to be okay sitting in discomfort
hmm,
as well?
yeah.
Um, yeah, and some other things that I thought were really interesting. You talked about this conflict from ambiguous relations, and maybe really think about like the ethical principles of being a social worker and our relationship with our clients, whether those clients be individuals, communities, organizations, or what have you, and like how we establish ourselves in like a helping profession without kind of taking control there. And I've found that this is also present when you're working with other organizations who are also change leaders. And we see these like power dynamics of people who want to take the lead on that change, or people whose voices want to be heard or advocate the best for their people and their community, when truthfully we're all, kind of in this together. And I don't think that there's any maybe everything I just said was very ambiguous. And there's no answer to, there wasn't a question and there's not an answer to it. It's just, again, about like, how do we learn to sit in that discomfort and kind of come together to figure out what's next. So just kind of keeping an eye on the time. And I want to make sure that we have some time for other individuals to ask questions. Otherwise, I can certainly fill that time. Don't worry. But I would love to know what advice you would give to current students who feel uncertain about how or where to make an impact in the field of social work or social change.
think I think it's always I hope this is not a cop out. I think it's go back to your gut. Like it's I think sometimes I feel like as you get older and you're developing in a career or in a profession, you're always coming up on new things you don't know, right? And I think that that tendency is to kind of, or can be like, oh, I need to know that, and I should maybe know that. And I like, sometimes I think that can be good, of course. But I think that also, I think sometimes it's worth going back to the thing that moves you, that energizes you, that you sort of tapped in maybe when you were younger, that I don't know. I think that there can be definitely a professional tendency, I think, to continue to go somewhere else. And I think there's a lot to be said for going back to the thing that you know or that you care about, um, and bringing that in as much as possible. I think that what I see is that people they try to downplay parts of their life to get to the next thing. And I think that where all of the interesting stuff happens is when people combine all of their parts. Like it's where it's the fact I just talked to somebody actually who was he was one of my professors at Pitt. I think he was an adjunct. He's somewhere else now, but he's writing a book. And I told he's working through the kind of the messy parts of it. And I was like, nobody has spent 10 years in that place organizing and 10 years in that place organizing and came from that other place you came from. Like nobody in the world has done that except for you. So nobody knows the connections and the combinations between that and that and that. Nobody else has seen it, nobody understands it, and nobody knows it. And actually your style, like who you are as a person, definitely as a writer, but like who you are as a person comes from the way that you combine pieces, right? And so I think I think in grad school, I think it can be a challenge or undergrad too, but like it can be a challenge because you're trying to like get to that professional level where you're like, I'm in the field, maybe I'm managing people now, maybe I'm like slightly quote unquote higher than I was before I came into grad or into school. And I think that's true, but I think that like I would just say like don't edit out parts to get to whatever that next level is. Because what you're actually gonna need is that combination and that weird funky mix of whatever you bring. That's always the thing. I think about this like nobody needs like nobody needs like people giving presentations with three takeaways that they introduce at the beginning and then they remind people of and then they tell one like nobody we don't need any more of the formulaic anything in any of our fields. Like I think that there will always be enough people doing that. And I think that the more you can combine things and find ways to not need to do that, I just wholly support that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Um, I love that you talked a lot about like grad school as this like challenge for kind of finding yourself and finding your worth through your experience. As someone who, graduated a couple of years ago, but is also nearing their 28th birthday, I tend to think that every year, like, all right, more people are going to start to think like I'm an expert, I'm wiser, they're going to trust me. And truthfully, I'm just always going to be that silly person who is bringing fun into the work that we do. But I think it also just kind of goes back to that we're all experts in our own experience. And that's something that we talk about a lot throughout the program, and something that you just like come to accept and realize later. And I know we see the sun is setting on me here in Colorado. So I do have one more question for you, and then we can open it up. And again, I can certainly ask more if we have additional time for that. But what do you miss most about Pitt's campus
Oh, it's
or
campus.
Pittsburgh in general? That's fine.
Yeah. I think the library. I feel like I
Yeah.
spent a lot of time in that library. Like, it's like one of those things. This is a very dorky story, but I remember, I remember writing a paper and losing the paper. Like, I didn't save it or whatever, and then just like having to write a paper in like whatever 4 hours or something. This will age me a little bit, but like I just put on Meek Mill like a boss, like on repeat, like for 4 hours, and I was just in that library, just like writing this. I just remember like bobbing like this for like 4 hours with Meek Mill playing. So I think, yeah, I feel like the library is. I feel like I spent a lot of time in the library, like,
Mhm.
yeah, just like doing work, but then also just like strolling. I think is a good. Yeah, I like that library.
Well, I hate to say it, Kyle, but you aged yourself before talking about Meek Mill because you lost a paper, and we all know we have autosave these days. Like that stuff, that stuff doesn't get lost. But I feel that pain. I've certainly lost things before.
It fell out of
Um,
the suitcase, yeah.
all right, so I'd love to open up the discussion to anyone else who has additional questions. Of course, we've got some backups here, if not, but um, feel free to throw it in the chat. I'm happy to read it out loud or just come off of mute and speak away.
I do have a question. I have toddlers running around though, so that's why my video is off. You might hear some screaming. I think it's really fascinating that you like the focus on social change. I'm just curious in terms of like response. Do you get pushback like from other sectors? Because like I feel like the business world is like a little bit less embracing of ambiguity.
Oh, that's funny. That's a great question. I would say first that I think that, well, first, thank you for coming on with toddlers in the background. I have a toddler in the other room with watching The Lion King with grandma right now. So it's like, so thank you. I know it's hard to multitask those things. Um, I was most concerned with people trying to create change having adverse feelings to it. I think that was the biggest challenge to me was trying to make the case for it in a way that felt hopeful, like honest and trusting. Because I think that we all want to be open and transparent and trusting. And I think that like for social work, especially like that forms the basis of relationships, that forms the basis of any kind of this work. So I there was this real it's really hard to make the case for it while I think also recognizing the very real, like valid reasons we have to all have a huge aversion to it. And I think the reason we all have an aversion to it is that like we see people in power do it and use it in all of these negative ways. And so yeah, for me it's like I think the I spend my time trying to make the case for it with people trying to create change, and I have a personal I think knowing the tendencies of people in power and business, like I don't have a real strong urge to make this a more common idea at that level or in those areas. I think for me, we need to remember this. We need to remember that like this is how people move. This is how people survive and protect one another and take care of people. It's how people like have done all sorts of amazing things when it looked like they shouldn't have been able to. I don't really need like scumbags with lots of power. Like, you know what I mean? Feeling like, oh, I can be a little more deceptive because I feel like it's a good thing. Like, I don't need like I just I don't I think that they rock with that approach enough with whatever morals they have. I think that yeah, I think I'm more concerned about it over here. It is interesting, I will say, like slightly more upbeat than that. A lot of fields do want to feel like they're good at embracing ambiguity. So, as a broad general thing. So, in business, people who want to do innovative things, like ambiguity is a part of doing something that's never been done before. Designers spend a lot of time in the murky space of I'm researching, I'm building, I'm doing, I'm testing, and the answer is not clear, and I'm living in that space for a long time. So there are definitely disciplines where there's overlap of some of those things and people want to be good with it. But yeah, I think it's kind of all that. Thinking that I appreciate that question. That's a good question.
I think nothing changes without a little bit of discomfort. We're all say we're great with being adaptable, and with this topic of ambiguity, but truthfully, I think when we all kind of find our challenge with that, then that's when we're inspired to change. Uh, yeah. Any other questions?
I feel like we need one from each person, don't you think?
What's your favorite color is good too.
That's a good. You know what's funny about that is I'm colorblind, and I swear that's somewhere in the back of my psyche with this idea is that like the number of sunsets I've been to where I think it's past the beautiful point because it looks very dull, and everybody else is oohing and awing. I'm like, I feel like somewhere in the back of my head is like we're not all seeing the exact same thing. I actually just saw some, I don't even know if it's true, but something about like the animals that tigers hunt, they see them like as green. Like we see them as orange and black, but
Hmm.
actually like they blend into the vegetation because they have a different kind of eye. Um, So anyways, I think that there is some element of like, I don't even know if we all know what we're looking at most of
Mhm.
the
So
time.
to you, I'm not having the golden hour moment that I think I'm having right now.
No, I got it. I'm there. I'm there.
All right. Well, I think that's a good way to kind of wrap things up. We've really enjoyed having you here, Kyle. Um, for those just popping in, just want to remind you, Ambiguity is the answer is out. It has not arrived in the Denver Public Library system just yet, but I'm sure it's out in Pittsburgh. So make sure to get your hands on it, and I will as soon as I can.
Before we wrap up, Kyle, where can people find you? Do you have, somewhere that you like to promote what you have going on, promote this book, maybe, any contact information that you might want to share? Or I can also filter that if people want to reach out directly to the school, and then I can forward them your way.
Yeah, people are welcome to. Oh, I have a website.
Okay.
KyleCrawford.co. I'm on Instagram. I don't do. I'm not heavy on any of it, but you're welcome to hit me up at any time. The book is available anywhere except the Denver Public Library, if you want to get it. But if you get it from the publisher Fallow Press, it's also a good place to get it. So fallowpress.com. But yeah, appreciate you guys being here and asking great questions. This was fun.
Internet is the answer, people. Do your research.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle.